Welcome to True Crime Audio Pod, where we unravel the threads of the most disturbing true crime stories. In today's story, we delve into the chilling 1988 disappearance of Annie Laurie Hearin, a wealthy Mississippi socialite whose mysterious kidnapping led investigators down a twisted path of deceit, revenge, and a courtroom drama centered around disgraced attorney Newton Winn. Tuesday, July 26, 1988, dawned with the promise of southern charm and leisure for Annie Laurie Hearin, a wealthy socialite and prominent figure in Jackson, Mississippi. At 72 years old, Annie had planned a tranquil afternoon in her stately Woodland Drive home, located in the affluent Woodland Hills neighborhood. The sprawling, tree-shaded estate, exuding the genteel sophistication of the Old South, was the perfect setting for her planned luncheon and bridge game with friends. The day's agenda was simple: an indulgence in traditional Southern cuisine, pleasant conversation, and a few competitive rounds of cards. For Annie, this was a cherished routine, an opportunity to bask in the camaraderie of her circle. Around 2:30 p.m., after several hours of laughter and good company, Annie's guests gathered their belongings, thanked their gracious hostess, and drove away, leaving her waving goodbye on the doorstep. Inside the mansion, Annie remained in good spirits as she oversaw her housekeeper, who dutifully tidied up the remnants of the luncheon and card game. The housekeeper completed her tasks and left around 3 p.m., leaving Annie alone in her expansive home. It was a rare quiet moment for her, as her husband, 70-year-old Robert Hearin Sr., was not expected back from work until late afternoon. Despite his age, Robert maintained a full work schedule, managing his numerous business ventures. When Robert arrived home at approximately 4:30 p.m., he was greeted by an unusual stillness. Annie was nowhere to be found. Though curious, he was not immediately alarmed. Perhaps she had gone out on an unexpected errand or decided to visit a friend, he thought. Confident she would return shortly, Robert decided to rest, taking a brief nap upstairs. By the time he woke and began preparing for dinner, there was still no sign of Annie. His curiosity gave way to growing concern. Robert began making calls, first to the housekeeper, hoping she might have some insight. She had none. Next, he reached out to Annie's bridge partners. Had Annie extended the afternoon with some impromptu socializing? Again, there was no news. As the hours passed, Robert's worry deepened. He reached out to a close relative, asking for help in searching the house and the surrounding property. Together, they scoured the grounds, calling Annie's name, checking every room and corner of the large home. By 7 p.m., with no sign of her, Robert made a call he had been dreading. He contacted the Jackson police. When officers arrived, they began a thorough examination of the estate. It was during this search that a piece of paper was discovered, lying unnoticed near the foyer of the main entrance. The note, written in poorly constructed English, brought Robert's worst fears crashing down. It confirmed that Annie Laurie Hearin had been kidnapped. The ransom note demanded action, but its instructions were baffling. It claimed Annie's abduction was linked to Robert's financial dealings with a company called School Pictures, Incorporated. The business, which specialized in school photography services like yearbook photos, was one of many ventures in Robert's portfolio. Though he was the company's largest shareholder, his involvement had always been peripheral. His primary focus had been on more significant enterprises, such as oil and gas companies. The note included the names of about a dozen individuals who, it alleged, had been financially wronged due to School Pictures' failures. The company had encountered operational issues after Robert sold it years prior, and its decline had resulted in lawsuits and financial losses for many investors. The note demanded that Robert repay their losses, totaling around $1 million, within 10 days. It concluded with a chilling ultimatum: do this before 10 days pass. Authorities immediately delved into the School Pictures connection. Their investigation confirmed that the company had struggled under new ownership after Robert divested his shares. Allegations of mismanagement and missing equipment had surfaced, leading to a series of legal disputes. Though Robert had successfully defended himself in court, the ordeal left a trail of bitter investors. As the police, FBI, and state police joined forces to unravel the mystery, the atmosphere inside the Woodland Hills estate turned somber. Each passing hour weighed heavily on Robert and the investigators. The ransom note offered no guarantees about Annie's safety, and the sinister undercurrents of revenge and financial ruin painted a bleak picture. The question loomed large: was this a desperate ploy by disgruntled investors, or was there something darker at play? And most harrowing of all, was Annie Laurie Hearin still alive? The race against time had begun. For the investigators working tirelessly to unravel the mystery of Annie Laurie Hearin's kidnapping, one question loomed large: who could be behind such a bold and calculated crime? The ransom note listed 12 names, individuals who had allegedly suffered financial losses tied to Robert Hearin's former company, School Pictures. Incorporated detectives focused on these names, reasoning that these individuals stood to benefit the most from Annie's safe return. However, there were troubling aspects to the case. Robert Hearin's immense wealth, estimated at over $20 million, was well known. A ransom demand for $1 million, while significant, was hardly a stretch for someone of his financial stature. Yet the bizarre nature of the demand stood out. The money wasn't for the kidnapper but was meant to compensate the 12 people listed in the note. It was almost unheard of for a kidnapper to forego direct profit. This curious detail cast doubt on whether the crime was driven purely by financial motives. The theory that all 12 individuals conspired to carry out the kidnapping was dismissed as implausible. Instead, investigators zeroed in on the idea that one individual, driven by hatred, bitterness, or revenge, had orchestrated the abduction. Adding to the urgency was Annie's precarious health. She suffered from ileitis, a chronic intestinal disease that required daily medication to manage inflammation and prevent complications. Without it, her condition could rapidly deteriorate, potentially leading to death. Whether the kidnapper intended to harm her or not, they had unknowingly placed her life in serious jeopardy by separating her from her medication. As detectives scoured the Hearin home, they uncovered a chilling clue. Near the front door, they found what appeared to be faint blood spatters. Initially unnoticed, the marks were subjected to laboratory testing. The blood type, A or positive, could not be definitively matched to Annie's medical records, leaving investigators with another unsettling piece of the puzzle but no clear answers. Jackson police quickly involved the FBI and alerted Mayor Dale Danks, who had a personal connection to the Hearins as a family friend. On the advice of law enforcement, the mayor requested that local media refrain from reporting on the case. While whispers of Annie's disappearance spread through Jackson's social circles, news outlets agreed to maintain silence to avoid compromising the investigation. As law enforcement pressed forward, one detail emerged that sent a ripple of intrigue through the case. Witnesses reported sightings of a suspicious white van near the Hearin mansion. The first sighting occurred 3 months before the kidnapping. A delivery man recalled seeing a white van with Florida license plates parked near the house. Another witness saw the van just over a week before Annie's abduction, parked at an intersection close to the mansion. Then, on the day of the kidnapping, a repairman working 2 blocks away spotted the van again. He observed the driver step out, but could not provide details about where the individual went. Despite the leads, the investigation hit a frustrating standstill. The van's movements suggested premeditation and surveillance, but its driver's identity remained a mystery. 2 days after Annie's disappearance, the story exploded into public view, sending shockwaves through Jackson and beyond. Annie Laurie Hearin was not just a wealthy socialite, she was a patron of the arts, an advisor to the State Arts Festival, and a fixture in Mississippi's cultural circles. Her kidnapping captivated the public, blending real-life terror with the intrigue of a Southern drama. Meanwhile, Robert Hearin, desperate to save his wife, followed the kidnapper's instructions to the letter. 12 separate checks were written out to the names on the ransom list, each in varying amounts. In one instance, a name on the list was no longer living, and Robert, adhering to the note's additional instructions, issued the payment to the deceased individual's children. Once the payments were sent, Robert made a public appeal. He begged for any word of Annie's whereabouts, urging the kidnapper to return her safely. For 2 agonizing weeks, friends and family waited for a sign. Every ring of the telephone and every knock on the door carried the potential for hope or despair. Finally, on August 15, 1988, nearly 3 weeks after the abduction, a letter arrived. Postmarked in Atlanta, Georgia, it had been written in Annie's own handwriting and dated August 10, 5 days before it was mailed. The letter was brief and haunting. Annie confirmed she was alive but pleaded for her husband to follow the kidnapper's demands. She described her confinement in the basement of a house. Her final words, ***, please save me, ***, were followed by her signature. The revelation brought both relief and dread. Annie's note suggested she was still alive as of August 10th, but her fate now rested on whether the kidnapper had kept their word. Adding to the torment was the realization that the letter, written days before, had been delayed in reaching its destination. Precious time had already been lost. The investigation intensified, but as days passed without further communication, hope for Annie's safe return began to waver. The tragedy was no longer just a personal nightmare for the Hearin family, it had become a tale of suspense that gripped an entire state. As weeks dragged on without word of Annie Laurie Hearin's fate, a baffling new twist emerged. Some of the ransom checks sent to individuals listed in the kidnapper's note began coming back. For reasons no one could immediately explain, several recipients returned their checks. Those who didn't were quickly investigated by police, but even the most thorough scrutiny confirmed they were incapable of orchestrating a kidnapping. Seasoned law enforcement officers were left scratching their heads. The idea of a kidnapper returning ransom money, or orchestrating a plan where others might, was unprecedented. But despite their confusion, detectives clung to one certainty: someone connected to that list of 12 names held the key to unraveling the mystery. Yet as the investigation advanced, every lead seemed to evaporate. Each individual on the list, respectable businessmen with seemingly solid alibis, failed to emerge as a credible suspect. Time passed, and with each day, the thin thread holding Annie's life seemed to grow more precarious. Detectives searched local pharmacies, hoping to identify any recent purchases of the medication Annie required for her ileitis. 2 purchases were flagged for further investigation, but both turned out to be legitimate prescriptions for other patients suffering from the same condition. The clock ticked mercilessly, and by the end of August, fears grew that Annie had already succumbed either to the absence of her life-saving medication or to the hands of a captor with far darker intentions. Despite these grim prospects, Robert Hearin refused to give up. He made another public plea, offering a $100,000 reward for information leading to Annie's safe return. His appeal, heartfelt and desperate, was met with silence. Days turned to weeks, and investigators began to entertain a harrowing possibility: the kidnapping may have been a ruse. Perhaps the true aim had been to torment Robert Hearin, targeting him not for money but for revenge. Digging deeper into the ill-fated school pictures business, detectives found themselves drawn to a man named Newton Winn, a 64-year-old attorney from St. Petersburg, Florida. Winn had initially been ruled out as a suspect, thanks to an apparently airtight alibi, but his connection to Hearin painted a portrait of simmering resentment. Years earlier, Winn had been embroiled in the financial collapse of School Pictures. He claimed to have invested heavily in the company, only for it to teeter on the brink of ruin. When Robert Hearin repurchased the company to salvage what remained, Winn sued, alleging he had been misled about the business's prospects. The court ruled against him, and Winn was ordered to pay Hearin a staggering $153,883 in damages. To satisfy this judgment, Winn saw much of his personal property seized and sold in October 1986. Once a successful attorney, he now stood on the edge of financial ruin. Detectives wondered, was this enough to ignite a desire for revenge, however misguided or unfairly motivated? Initially, Winn appeared to have an ironclad alibi for the day of Annie's abduction. He claimed to have been in Florida, spending time with a woman of questionable reputation. When the woman demanded payment for her company, Winn said he called an employee from his law office to bring him cash. The employee, John Spain, corroborated the story, affirming that he had delivered the money as instructed. On the surface, the alibi seemed unshakable. FBI agents followed up with Spain, who reiterated the same sequence of events. But despite the outwardly convincing account, doubts about Winn lingered. Detectives uncovered a peculiar detail that reignited their suspicions. Winn had made 3 separate trips to New Orleans in April 1988, just months before the kidnapping. On each visit, he rented a van. Twice, the van was white, a detail eerily consistent with witness reports of a white van spotted near the Hearin mansion. The discovery raised more questions. Why would a Florida attorney make repeated trips to Louisiana, renting a van each time? What was he transporting, and where was he going? The mystery deepened further when investigators learned that a van had been purchased in Tampa, Florida, under the name John Spain, Winn's trusted employee. When questioned, Spain admitted to buying the vehicle but offered only a feeble explanation, claiming Winn had paid for it and that the van technically belonged to him. The arrangement struck investigators as suspicious. Was Spain merely a loyal employee, or was he complicit in something far more sinister? As the noose of suspicion tightened around Winn, detectives turned their attention to another figure in his orbit, a woman with whom he had been romantically involved. Winn had met her the previous year while she was still married, and though their affair had ended, their contact had continued in 1988. This connection piqued investigators' interest, and under questioning, the woman began to share what she knew. Piece by piece, her account added new layers to the puzzle, each one bringing detectives closer to understanding the tangled web of motivations behind Annie Hearin's disappearance. As the investigation into Annie Laurie Hearin's kidnapping closed in on Newton Winn, more damning details began to emerge. One piece of the puzzle came from a woman he had once been romantically involved with, who described a peculiar and unsettling request he made in the days leading up to the abduction. Winn had called her unexpectedly, asking to meet at a motel in DeLand, Florida. When they met, he handed her a sealed letter and sternly warned her not to look at the address. His demeanor was unusual, serious, secretive, and tinged with desperation. He explained that he needed her to deliver the letter to Atlanta 5 days later and mail it from there. The task would be rewarded with $500 in cash. At the time, she didn't question it too deeply. Winn was a lawyer, after all, and she assumed the errand involved some peculiar but harmless legal maneuvering. She completed the mission, pocketed the money, and promptly forgot about it. But weeks later, when the headlines about Annie Hearin's kidnapping splashed across newspapers, including details about a ransom letter postmarked in Atlanta, her memory of the mysterious request came flooding back. The implications were chilling. She wasn't surprised when detectives eventually came knocking at her door. Her cooperation provided investigators with further circumstantial evidence implicating Winn. But it wasn't enough to act decisively. For that, detectives needed someone even closer to Winn to break. Detectives turned their attention back to John Spain, Winn's longtime paralegal and trusted confidant. Spain had initially vouched for Winn's alibi, placing him in Florida on the day of the kidnapping. But detectives suspected there was more to Spain's story, and under pressure, he finally cracked. Spain confessed that his initial account was a lie. On the night of July 26, 1988, Winn had asked him to provide a false alibi, explaining it was a personal favor. Spain agreed out of loyalty to his employer, who had helped him out of a difficult situation years earlier. But as the investigation deepened and suspicions mounted, Spain realized the gravity of what he'd been drawn into. His confession was a bombshell. It shattered Winn's alibi and gave law enforcement the leverage they needed. Shortly afterward, federal agents arrested Newton Winn as he walked through a parking lot in DeLand, Florida. He was charged with extortion and perjury in connection with the case, though the lack of a body meant he wasn't charged with kidnapping. On March 12, 1989, the FBI conducted a search of Winn's home and office. What they found painted a damning picture of premeditation and guilt. Among the items seized were maps of Jackson, Mississippi, with the Hearin home circled in red, 2 handguns, and an old Royal typewriter. Forensic analysis of the ransom letter revealed it had been typed on a 1920s-era Royal typewriter, a match to Winn's machine. With the evidence mounting, investigators felt confident they had their man. Still, Winn remained defiant, insisting on his innocence. He fought his extradition from Florida to Mississippi, delaying the case for months. But his legal maneuvers ultimately failed, and by January 29, 1990, jury selection began in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, for his trial. The trial began on January 30, 1990, presided over by federal judge Thomas Lee. Winn made a controversial decision. He chose to represent himself, a move that many saw as a display of arrogance or desperation. His strategy backfired spectacularly. Key witnesses, including John Spain and Winn's former lover, testified against him. Their accounts painted Winn as a man consumed by bitterness and revenge. Another witness, a Jackson resident, identified Winn as the driver of a white van seen near the Hearin home the day before the kidnapping. The physical evidence, maps, the typewriter, and the white van connections further dismantled Winn's claims of innocence. On February 7, 1990, the jury found Newton Winn guilty of extortion and perjury. Judge Lee sentenced him to 19 years in prison, effectively a life sentence for the 65-year-old attorney. Winn reacted to the verdict with fury, delivering a rambling, defiant speech in court, maintaining his innocence even as he was led away. He hobbled out of the courtroom on a cane, a defeated figure but still unwilling to admit his role in the crime. Though convicted for extortion and perjury related to her kidnapping and served time in prison, Winn maintained his innocence until his death on August 6, 2012, at the age of 88. Despite decades of speculation, Winn never revealed what truly happened to Annie, and investigators never uncovered her fate. Annie Laurie Hearin, once a beloved figure in her community, is still officially listed as missing. Her disappearance continues to haunt her family, friends, and the investigators who pursued every lead, only to find themselves at dead ends. With Winn's passing, the case has grown colder, leaving behind a legacy of unanswered questions, unresolved grief, and the enduring mystery of a woman who vanished without a trace.